I killed a man 12 years ago by accident. When I finally landed my dream job, my boss pulled me aside, and I finally understood why they really hired me. I was driving a forklift for a construction company, headed down a small hill when the brakes gave out. I pumped them twice, felt nothing, and watched the worst moment of my life happen in slow motion. The sound of impact is something I still hear when it gets too quiet. My coworker was 43 with 2 kids. I was 23 and covered in his blood while paramedics held me down and told me to stop screaming. The brakes had been reported broken twice. Corporate denied repairs both times to save money. But when investigators showed up, guess whose name was on the incident report? Not the executives, not the maintenance manager who ignored my requests. Mine. My court-appointed lawyer looked half asleep during my trial. The company's lawyers had binders full of evidence proving I was negligent. I sat there watching my entire future disappear. Then the sheriff who was first on scene took the stand. He looked at the judge and said, "This boy did everything right. The corporation is setting him up to take the fall, and we all know it." I got 10 years instead of 25. I was still going to prison for something that wasn't my fault, but at least I had a chance. Prison gave me 2 choices: waste time or use it. I chose use it. First year, I got my GED. Second year, I started college classes by mail. Other inmates thought I was crazy, staying up until 2 a.m., filling notebook after notebook with plans for a life nobody believed I'd ever have. But by the end of my time served, I had a degree in business and a master's in accounting. I saved every dollar from prison jobs and spent practically every penny on one Navy suit. The job interviews were brutal. Most hiring managers stopped listening the second they saw the 10-year gap. One guy literally laughed and said, "We don't hire your kind." However, I kept going. During one interview, the HR guy looked bored and barely glanced at my resume. Then a woman in an expensive blazer walked in. "Hi, I'll be taking over your interview now. You can call me Rebecca. I'm VP of Operations." She actually reads my transcripts and asked real questions. 2 days later, I had the job. I was a senior accountant with a salary that made me dizzy. For 3 months, everything was perfect. I paid rent 3 months in advance just because I could. Coworkers invited me to lunch like I was one of them. Then Rebecca cornered me in the break room. She leaned close and whispered, "I know you killed someone." My hands went cold. The coffee mug slipped an inch before I caught it. She noticed and smiled. "Relax. I'm not going to tell anyone, but you can open up to me. I understand what you've been through." I stared at her. "I'd rather not talk about it." Her smile disappeared. She walked away without another word. Prison taught me one thing. When someone says they won't snitch, they're usually planning something. So that night I downloaded a recording app on my phone. 2 weeks later, Rebecca calls me into her office. She locks the door and closes the blinds. "I have a business proposition," she says. "There's someone causing problems for this company. I need them handled permanently." I stare at her. "Handled how?" She tilts her head like I'm stupid. "You've killed before. I need you to do it again." I blink, hoping she'll take my pause as a chance to say she's joking. She doesn't, so I tell her, "That was a horrible accident." She rolls her eyes. "Oh, please, you survived prison. You know how to keep your mouth shut. You've proven you can live with blood on your hands." Everything clicks at once. "That's why you took over my interview," I say slowly. "That's why my salary is so high. You were never impressed by my degrees." She frowns. "You didn't think?" Panic forms on Rebecca's face as she slowly realizes her mistake. I know firsthand what happens when a corporation wants to keep secrets, so I force myself to breathe. "I didn't think anything. You're absolutely right. So, who's the target?" She takes a breath before saying, "A board member. Details later." I take a small step back. I need time to think about this, of course. Rebecca goes back to her computer as if nothing happened. "Take the weekend. But remember, your entire future here depends on this decision." I nod, keep my face calm, and walk out with my phone still recording in my pocket. That weekend, I walked into the police station with my recording. Monday morning, 2 detectives walked into our lobby. Rebecca was getting coffee when they put her in handcuffs. The CEO called me into his office that afternoon, terrified I'd sue. I sat across from him and said, "I just want to keep my job. I earned this position." He agreed before I finished the sentence. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He nodded fast, his hands flat on the desk like he needed something solid to hold on to. The CEO pulled out a folder and started writing on company letterhead, his pen scratching across the paper with quick movements. He slid it toward me, and I read the guarantee 3 times, making sure every word said exactly what I needed it to say. My job was safe, my salary stayed the same, and nothing about Rebecca's manipulation would show up in my employee file. I signed it and walked out with the document folded in my jacket pocket, feeling the weight of it against my chest. My phone rang while I was heating up leftover pasta that evening. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. Detective Fernandez introduced himself and asked if I had time to give a complete statement about what happened with Rebecca. I sat down at my kitchen table with the phone pressed to my ear and started from the beginning. He asked me to describe the interview where Rebecca took over, and I told him about how she actually read my transcripts while the HR guy looked bored. I explained the break room conversation where she said she knew about my past and how prison taught me that people who promise not to snitch are usually planning something. Detective Fernandez made a sound like he understood exactly what I meant. I walked him through downloading the recording app and Rebecca's office meeting where she asked me to kill a board member. He stopped me there and asked me to repeat her exact words, so I did. The detective recorded everything while his pen moved across paper on his end of the call. He asked about the weekend I spent deciding what to do, and I told him I walked into the police station because I knew what corporations do to people who threaten their secrets. Detective Fernandez thanked me and said he'd be in touch, his voice steady like he dealt with this kind of thing every day. Walking into work the next morning felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Everyone moved through the hallways like normal, getting coffee and talking about their weekends, but I could feel them watching me when they thought I wasn't looking. Antonio from the accounting department appeared next to my desk with 2 cups of coffee and set one down in front of me. He said he was glad I was still here, his voice casual like he was just making conversation. I stared at the coffee cup and realized this was the first time someone at work had treated me like a regular person in days. Antonio asked if I wanted to review the quarterly reports together, and I said yes, because focusing on numbers felt easier than thinking about everything else. We spent 2 hours going through spreadsheets, and he never once asked about Rebecca or the police or why detectives had walked through the lobby on Monday morning. Kieran from HR sent me a meeting request before lunch, and my stomach dropped when I saw it. I walked to his office expecting the worst, but he just gestured to a chair and asked how I was holding up. He wanted to know if I needed time off or different work duties while everything got sorted out. I told him I'd rather keep working because sitting at home would make my head spiral into dark places. Kieran nodded like he understood, without me having to explain that prison taught me idle time leads to bad thoughts. He asked if I wanted to adjust my schedule or work remotely some days, but I said no. Routine kept me steady, and breaking routine felt dangerous. He made notes on his computer and told me his door was open if anything changed. I walked back to my desk, feeling strange, because someone with power had just asked what I needed instead of telling me what to do. Rebecca's face appeared on the local news that evening while I was eating dinner. Her lawyer stood on the courthouse steps talking about entrapment and manipulation, claiming his client had been misunderstood. I watched with my fork frozen halfway to my mouth as the lawyer said Rebecca was a dedicated professional who never would have solicited violence. The news anchor mentioned my recording, and the lawyer's face got tight. My hands started shaking so hard I had to put my fork down. Part of me couldn't believe I'd actually beaten someone who thought they could use my past to turn me into a killer. The lawyer kept talking about how the recording was taken out of context, but I remembered Rebecca's exact words about handling someone permanently. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, my heart pounding against my ribs. Detective Fernandez called again 2 days later. Rebecca's lawyer was trying to claim I misunderstood her intentions during our conversation, that she'd been speaking hypothetically about corporate competition. I felt my chest get tight because I'd heard this strategy before. Corporations twisted words until they meant something different, until the person telling the truth looked like the liar. Detective Fernandez said the recording was crystal clear and her words couldn't be interpreted any other way. He asked if I'd be willing to testify if this went to trial. I said yes immediately, because I wasn't going to let her lawyer do to me what that construction company's lawyers did 12 years ago. The detective thanked me and said he'd keep me updated on the case progress. Joanne walked into my office the next afternoon and introduced herself as the company attorney. She sat down across from my desk and explained that Rebecca's actions exposed the company to massive liability, so they wanted to support me completely. I waited for the catch because there's always a catch when lawyers get involved. Joanne said the company would cover any legal fees if Rebecca's defense tried to sue me, and they'd provide full documentation of my employment performance, separate from anything Rebecca influenced. She talked to me like I was a valued employee instead of a criminal they needed to manage, and I didn't know how to process that. She asked if I had any questions, and I said I just wanted to make sure my job was safe. Joanne pulled out the document the CEO had signed and explained that it was legally binding, that nothing about Rebecca's manipulation could be used against me in performance reviews or promotion decisions. I nodded, still waiting for her to say something that would make this feel like a trap, but she just stood up and told me to contact her directly if I needed anything. Ralph Zimmerman sent me a meeting request that same week. I looked up his name in the company directory and saw he was the board member Rebecca had wanted dead. My hands went cold when I realized I was about to meet the person I'd saved by going to the police. Ralph turned out to be a kind-looking man in his 60s with gray hair and smile lines around his eyes. He shook my hand and thanked me for saving his life, his voice quiet and serious. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Ralph asked if there was anything he could do to help me professionally, and I felt uncomfortable because I didn't want anyone thinking I'd done this for favors or rewards. He seemed to understand my hesitation and said he just wanted to make sure I had the support I deserved after doing the right thing in an impossible situation. I told Ralph I just wanted to prove I earned this job through my actual qualifications, not because Rebecca had some twisted plan for me. He nodded slowly and said he was reviewing all of Rebecca's hiring decisions to make sure no one else had been brought in under false reasons. The thought that Rebecca might have done this to other people made me feel sick. Ralph explained that the board took this situation very seriously, and they wanted to make sure the company's hiring practices were completely clean going forward. He asked about my background in accounting, and I told him about getting my degrees in prison. Ralph listened without judgment, asking real questions about my coursework and what areas of finance interested me most. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end, I realized he genuinely cared about helping me succeed. Antonio stopped by my desk the next day and asked if I wanted to grab lunch with him and some other accountants. My first instinct was to say no because isolation felt safer than putting myself out there. But I thought about what Kieran had said about needing support, so I agreed. We went to a sandwich place down the street, and the other accountants complained about spreadsheet errors and upcoming audit deadlines like I was just another member of the team. Nobody asked about Rebecca or the police or my past. They argued about whether the new expense tracking software was actually better than the old system, and someone made a joke about the CFO's terrible ties. I sat there eating my sandwich and realized this was what normal workplace friendships looked like, people just being people without agendas or manipulation. Antonio caught my eye and smiled, and I smiled back, because for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe I could actually belong here. The prosecutor called me 3 days later. His name was Vaughn Harrington, and he wanted to meet at his office downtown to go over the preliminary hearing. I showed up early and sat in the waiting area watching other people come and go with their lawyers. When Vaughn came out to get me, he shook my hand and led me back to a small conference room with stacks of file folders covering the table. He pulled out a legal pad and asked me to walk him through everything again from the beginning. I told him about the interview, about Rebecca cornering me in the break room, about the recording I made. Vaughn took notes and asked specific questions about timing and exact wording. Then he looked up at me and said he'd reviewed my criminal record and wanted to discuss it. My stomach went tight waiting for the judgment, but he just explained that Rebecca's lawyer would definitely bring it up and we needed to be ready. He asked how I felt about my conviction, and I told him it wasn't fair, but I'd accepted it and moved forward. Vaughn nodded and said that was exactly the right answer, because it showed I took responsibility without being a victim. He spent another hour preparing me for cross-examination, and by the end, I felt less scared about testifying. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out, and Vaughn told me to stay calm and stick to the facts. The preliminary hearing happened on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor polish. I sat outside until they called me in, and when I walked through the doors, I saw Rebecca sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. She turned and stared at me with eyes that looked cold and angry. The judge asked me to state my name, and I did. Then Vaughn walked me through my testimony about Rebecca's solicitation. I explained the break room conversation, the office meeting, the recording I made. Rebecca's lawyer objected twice, but the judge overruled both times. When it was the defense's turn, they asked about my manslaughter conviction and implied I was violent and unstable. I kept my voice steady and explained it was an industrial accident caused by corporate negligence. The judge seemed to understand, and after another hour of testimony, she ruled there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. I walked out of the courthouse feeling both relieved and completely exhausted. Vaughn caught up with me in the hallway and said I did great, that my testimony was solid and believable. Work became the only place where things felt normal. I threw myself into financial reports and audit preparations because numbers made sense when nothing else did. Kieran stopped by my desk every week to check how I was managing. He never made a big deal about it, just asked if I needed anything and reminded me the company supported me. I appreciated that he didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile. The other accountants gradually stopped whispering when I walked by and started including me in their regular complaints about spreadsheet errors and deadline pressure. Antonio invited me to lunch most days, and we talked about normal things like sports and weekend plans. Nobody asked about Rebecca or the hearing or my past unless I brought it up first. The routine of showing up and doing my job kept me grounded when everything else felt unstable. The nightmares started about 3 weeks after the hearing. I'd dream I was back in my cell, and then Rebecca would appear outside the bars telling me I belonged there. Sometimes I'd wake up confused about where I was, reaching for the wall to figure out if I was in prison or my apartment. After the third night of this, I realized I couldn't handle it alone. I'd spent 10 years learning to deal with things by myself, but this felt different. Rebecca had gotten inside my head in a way that normal coping wasn't fixing. I asked Kieran if the company insurance covered therapy, and he said it did, then gave me a list of providers who specialized in trauma. I picked a therapist named Brigitte Lombardi because her profile mentioned she worked with manipulation and criminal justice trauma. Her office was in a quiet building with comfortable chairs and plants everywhere. During our first session, she asked me to describe what Rebecca did, and I walked through the whole timeline. Brigitte listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that surprised me. She explained that Rebecca specifically targeted my vulnerability, that she researched my background and crafted her approach to exploit my fear of being seen as violent. Brigitte told me that recognizing manipulation didn't mean I was weak. It meant I was smart enough to protect myself before she could use me. That reframing helped, because I'd been feeling stupid for not seeing it sooner. We talked about the nightmares, and she gave me some techniques for grounding myself when I woke up disoriented. By the end of the session, I felt like maybe I could actually work through this, instead of just surviving it. Detective Fernandez called me at work 2 days later. He said Rebecca's lawyer was pushing hard for a plea deal because the recording made their case almost impossible to win at trial. Vaughn wanted my input on whether I'd be okay with a plea or if I wanted to push for trial. I asked what kind of plea they were offering, and Detective Fernandez said probably 8 to 10 years with possibility of parole. I told him I needed to think about it and hung up feeling conflicted. Part of me wanted this over quickly, but another part wanted Rebecca to face a jury and hear them say she was guilty. I called Vaughn that evening from my apartment. He answered on the second ring, and I told him I wanted Rebecca to go to trial. I explained that she didn't just try to manipulate me. She tried to turn me into a murderer and destroy whatever life I'd managed to rebuild after prison. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, then said he respected my position and would push for maximum charges. He warned me that trial would be harder and longer than a plea, but I told him I was ready. After we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling certain I'd made the right choice. Rebecca needed to face real consequences for what she tried to do. Antonio and I went out for drinks after work on Friday. We found a quiet bar near the office and ordered beers. After the first round, Antonio admitted he'd looked up my case online after Rebecca got arrested. My chest went tight waiting for him to say something judgmental, but instead, he told me about his uncle who did 5 years for drug possession. Antonio said his uncle came out a better man who turned his life around and now ran a successful landscaping business. He looked at me and said, "Sometimes the system gets things wrong, but what matters is what you do after." I felt something loosen in my chest, knowing I wasn't the only person at this table who understood what reintegration actually meant. We ordered another round and talked about normal things like his kids' soccer games and my terrible fantasy football picks. Ralph found me at my desk the following Monday morning. He asked if I had a few minutes, and I followed him to a small conference room. Ralph explained that he'd been impressed with my work and wanted to propose something. He said my accounting skills were solid, but understanding board-level decision-making could accelerate my career significantly. He offered to mentor me in corporate finance strategy to teach me how executives think about financial planning and risk management. I felt suspicious at first because every time someone offered to help me, there'd been strings attached. Ralph seemed to notice my hesitation and said he just wanted to invest in someone with potential, no hidden agenda. I agreed cautiously, and we scheduled our first session for later that week. The mentorship sessions with Ralph turned out to be genuine. He brought me copies of board reports and walked me through how executives analyze financial data differently than accountants. He explained the political considerations that go into budget decisions and taught me how to present numbers in ways that told a compelling story. Ralph was patient when I asked basic questions and never made me feel stupid for not knowing things. After our third session, I started to believe that maybe someone with power was actually investing in me without expecting something corrupt in return. It felt strange and uncomfortable, but also hopeful in a way I hadn't experienced before. Ralph mentioned he saw real potential in my analytical thinking and suggested I consider pursuing additional certifications in corporate finance. For the first time since leaving prison, I started thinking about a career path instead of just surviving day to day. My next therapy session with Brigitte happens on a Wednesday afternoon. I sit in her office, and she asks how I'm handling things at work. I tell her I keep waiting for someone else to reveal they had bad reasons for helping me. She nods and writes something in her notebook. Then she looks up and says that my caution makes sense given what Rebecca did to me. But she points out that not everyone is Rebecca. My boss Kieran hasn't asked me for anything. Ralph genuinely seems to enjoy teaching me about corporate finance. Antonio just wanted a friend who understood what being judged felt like. Brigitte tells me that protecting myself is healthy, but isolation isn't the same as safety. I sit with that for a minute because it feels true in a way that makes me uncomfortable. She asks me to think about the difference between someone earning my trust and someone trying to manipulate it. Rebecca rushed intimacy and created obligation. The people helping me now are just being decent without expecting anything back. I leave her office feeling like maybe I can let people in without assuming they'll hurt me. The next week, Vaughn calls to tell me Rebecca's trial date got scheduled for 4 months out. He warns me that her defense team will probably attack my background during testimony. They'll bring up my manslaughter conviction and try to make the jury think I misunderstood an innocent conversation. Vaughn asks if I'm prepared for that kind of cross-examination. I tell him I expected it from the start. My criminal record is public information, and Rebecca's lawyers will use everything they can find. But the recording speaks for itself, and I'm not afraid to stand by the truth. Vaughn sounds satisfied with my answer and says he'll keep me updated on pre-trial motions. After we hang up, I feel steady instead of anxious. Rebecca tried to use my past as leverage, and it backfired completely. Kieran calls a staff meeting the following Monday to announce new hiring policies. He explains that the company is implementing oversight requirements for all senior-level positions. From now on, multiple executives have to approve any hire above a certain salary threshold. The policy came directly from the board after they reviewed how Rebecca abused her authority. Kieran doesn't mention my situation specifically, but several co-workers glance at me during his presentation. Their expressions look respectful rather than judgmental. After the meeting, Antonio catches up with me in the hallway and says the new policy is long overdue. He mentions that everyone knows I did the right thing by reporting Rebecca. I feel something shift in my chest because my co-workers see me as someone who stood up to corruption instead of someone who got manipulated. A letter arrives at my apartment 2 weeks later with a return address from the sheriff's department in my hometown. I open it carefully and recognize the handwriting immediately. The sheriff who testified at my trial 12 years ago somehow heard about Rebecca's case. He writes that he's been following my story through law enforcement channels. He says he's proud I turned my life around and stayed honest when someone tried to corrupt me. The letter mentions that he always knew I'd make something of my second chance if given the opportunity. Reading his words makes my vision blur. I sit on my couch holding the letter and cry for the first time since my arrest. The sheriff believed in me when I was a terrified kid covered in someone else's blood. Now he's telling me I proved him right. I fold the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer where I keep important documents. Antonio invites me to play basketball with his weekly group on Saturday morning. I show up at the outdoor court and meet 5 other guys who all work in different industries. They're friendly and competitive in an easy way that feels normal. I'm terrible at basketball because I spent my 20s in prison instead of playing pickup games. But nobody cares that I miss most of my shots. We play for 2 hours and then grab coffee at a nearby shop. The conversation stays casual with people talking about sports and weekend plans. Nobody asks about my background or why Antonio brought a new person. I realize I'm building a social life based on who I am now instead of what happened to me years ago. Antonio introduces me as his coworker who's learning the game, and everyone accepts that without needing more information. Ralph stops by my desk on Monday and asks if I'm free for a few hours on Wednesday. He wants me to shadow him at a board meeting where they'll discuss quarterly financial projections. I agree immediately because watching executives analyze numbers sounds fascinating. Wednesday arrives and I sit in the back of the boardroom taking notes while Ralph and 6 other board members review spreadsheets. They're debating whether to invest in new equipment or hold cash for potential market changes. I notice a pattern in the expense data that suggests seasonal fluctuation rather than actual growth. During a pause, I raise my hand and mention what I observed. Ralph asks me to explain my analysis, and I walk through the numbers showing how timing affects the quarterly comparison. 2 other board members lean forward to look at the data more carefully. One of them says, "My observation changes their recommendation about the equipment purchase." Ralph beams at me like a proud mentor and thanks me for the insight. After the meeting, he tells me I have a natural talent for strategic analysis. My next session with Brigitte shifts into deeper territory. She asks about the forklift accident and the coworker I killed. I've spent 12 years carrying guilt about his death, even though the brakes weren't my fault. Brigitte listens while I describe the sound of impact and how his blood covered my hands. Then she says something that stops me cold. She tells me that corporate negligence killed my coworker. The company ignored safety reports and denied repairs to save money. I was just the person holding the controls when their greed finally caught up with them. The executives who made those decisions walked away clean while I went to prison. Brigitte asks me to consider that I've been carrying blame that belongs to people who never faced consequences. I sit in her office processing this new way of looking at the worst moment of my life. Maybe I'm not a killer who got unlucky. Maybe I'm a scapegoat who survived. Detective Fernandez calls on a Thursday evening sounding satisfied. He tells me Rebecca tried to contact me through a third party asking if I'd be willing to meet with her. The contact violated her bail conditions immediately. A judge revoked her bail that afternoon, and now she's sitting in jail awaiting trial. Fernandez says this eliminates any concern about her approaching me before the trial date. I feel relief wash through me because I'd been carrying low-level anxiety about running into her somewhere. Now she's locked up and can't try to intimidate me or change my testimony. I thank Fernandez for the update, and he tells me I did good work by reporting her original contact attempt. After we hang up, I sleep better than I have in weeks. Kieran schedules my first performance review since Rebecca's arrest. I sit in his office while he walks through my ratings in every category. He marks me as exceeding expectations across the board for technical skills, teamwork, and professional judgment. The review document makes no mention of Rebecca or the criminal case. Kieran treats me purely as an accountant whose work quality deserves recognition. He mentions that my analysis has been consistently strong and other team members appreciate my attention to detail. Then he asks if I have any professional development goals for the next review period. I tell him I'm interested in learning more about corporate finance strategy. Kieran makes a note and says he'll work with Ralph to create additional learning opportunities. Walking out of his office, I feel professional validation I've never experienced before. Someone evaluated my work based on merit instead of my background. Vaughn asks me to meet at his office to prepare for trial testimony. I take a half day off work and spend 3 hours going through likely defense questions. Vaughn plays the role of Rebecca's lawyer asking hostile questions about my criminal record. He asks how I can be trusted when I killed someone. He suggests I manipulated Rebecca into making incriminating statements. He questions whether I understood her meaning correctly. After each question, Vaughn stops, and we discuss the best way to respond. When he asks how I'll handle them bringing up my manslaughter conviction, I tell him I'll own it completely. I'm not ashamed of surviving what that corporation did to me. I went to prison because executives chose profit over safety and needed someone to blame. but I used that time to earn degrees and build skills. Rebecca thought my past made me controllable, but it actually made me careful enough to protect myself. Vaughn nods approvingly and says that kind of confidence will serve me well on the witness stand. The company holiday party invitation sits on my desk for 3 days before Antonio notices I haven't RSVP'd. He leans against my cubicle wall and asks if I'm planning to go. I tell him I'm not really a party person. He crosses his arms and says, "That's exactly why I should go, because hiding at home means Rebecca still has power over how I live my life." His words hit harder than I expect because he's right. I've been avoiding anything social since her arrest, treating every gathering like a potential threat. Antonio writes my name on the RSVP list without asking permission and tells me he'll pick me up at 7. That afternoon, I mention the party to Brigitte during our session. She asks what makes me anxious about attending. I list the obvious things like small talk and crowded rooms, but then admit the real fear is that people will see me as the ex-convict who got manipulated instead of just a co-worker. Brigitte reminds me that practicing being present in normal social situations is part of rebuilding my life. She says I don't have to stay all night, just show up and see what happens. I agree to go for 1 hour, which feels manageable. The party fills the top-floor conference room with string lights and a buffet table. Antonio finds me immediately and hands me a beer before I can change my mind about staying. Ralph spots us near the food and walks over with genuine warmth on his face. He tells the group of executives standing nearby that I'm his mentee and they should get to know me. A woman from the finance department asks about my thoughts on the new accounting software rollout. I give her my honest opinion about the interface problems, and she nods like my perspective matters. Another executive jumps in asking about quarterly forecasting methods, and suddenly I'm having an actual professional conversation. Nobody mentions Rebecca or my background. They're asking about market trends and accounting innovations like I'm just another professional with valuable insights. The conversation flows naturally for 20 minutes before the group shifts to discuss their holiday plans. Standing there with my beer, listening to normal workplace banter, I realize something has changed. These people see me as a senior accountant, not as someone with a criminal record. The difference feels like breathing clean air after years of holding my breath. Antonio catches my eye from across the room and grins because he knows exactly what I'm feeling. Christmas approaches, and I plan to spend it alone in my apartment, like I have every year since prison. Antonio mentions his family's celebration during lunch and casually asks what I'm doing for the holiday. I tell him nothing special. He pulls out his phone and texts his mom right there, then shows me her response inviting me to join them. I start to decline, but Antonio cuts me off and says his uncle did time years ago and always brings an extra guest who might need family during the holidays. The invitation isn't pity, it's just what they do. Christmas Day, I show up at Antonio's parents' house with a store-bought pie and immediate regret about intruding. His mom answers the door and hugs me like I'm already family. The house smells like roasted meat and cinnamon. Antonio's uncle finds me in the kitchen an hour later and introduces himself. He's older with gray hair and kind eyes. He mentions he did 8 years for drug possession and asks how I'm handling reintegration. I'm startled by his directness, but also relieved. We spend the next hour talking about the challenges of rebuilding after prison. He understands the constant anxiety about background checks and the feeling that you're always one mistake away from losing everything. Sitting at Antonio's family table later, surrounded by warmth and genuine inclusion, I remember what healthy relationships look like. Nobody treats me like a charity case or a cautionary tale. They just treat me like a person who belongs at their table. Antonio's niece asks me about accounting and whether it's boring. I tell her it's like solving puzzles with numbers, and she seems satisfied with that answer. Driving home that night, I realize I don't feel like the only person who understands my struggle anymore. Rebecca's trial begins the second week of January in a downtown courthouse. Vaughn calls me the night before to remind me about staying calm and sticking to the facts. I barely sleep because my brain keeps rehearsing potential questions. The courthouse steps are covered in ice, and I nearly slip walking up to the entrance. Security takes forever checking bags and IDs. The courtroom is smaller than I expected, with old wooden benches and fluorescent lights. Rebecca sits at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking calm. Her lawyer is a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who keeps glancing at me like I'm already a problem. Vaughn puts me on the stand late morning on day 2. The bailiff swears me in, and I sit down, trying not to shake. Vaughn starts with basic questions about my employment and how I met Rebecca. I explain the interview process and my first 3 months at the company. Then he asks about the break room conversation. I describe exactly what Rebecca said about knowing I killed someone and how her tone made me uncomfortable. Vaughn plays the recording, and the courtroom goes silent, listening to Rebecca's voice offering me money to handle someone permanently. When it ends, Vaughn asks if I had any doubt about what she meant. I say no. She was clearly asking me to commit murder. Rebecca's lawyer objects 3 times during my testimony, but the judge overrules each one. Then comes cross-examination. Rebecca's lawyer stands up and asks about my manslaughter conviction. I tell her the basic facts about the forklift accident. She asks if I have a history of violence. I say no. That was a workplace accident caused by corporate negligence. She suggests I might have misunderstood Rebecca's intentions because of my criminal mindset. I stay calm and say the recording speaks for itself. She tries to paint me as someone who manipulated the conversation to sound incriminating. Vaughn objects, and the judge sustains it. The lawyer asks why I recorded the conversation if I wasn't planning to entrap Rebecca. I explain that prison taught me to protect myself when someone shows suspicious interest in my background. The cross-examination lasts 90 minutes, but my testimony holds up. Walking out of the courtroom, I feel steady for the first time in months. The prosecution brings in a workplace expert the next day to testify about predatory recruitment and manipulation tactics. The expert is a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She explains how certain employers specifically target vulnerable populations, including ex-convicts, because they're easier to manipulate and less likely to report abuse. Vaughn asks if Rebecca's approach fits this pattern. The expert walks through each step of Rebecca's behavior, from taking over my interview to offering an inflated salary to leveraging my criminal history. She says Rebecca's tactics are textbook examples of predatory recruitment designed to create leverage over an employee. The expert explains that people with criminal records often feel they owe their employer loyalty beyond normal professional boundaries because employment opportunities are so limited. Rebecca specifically targeted my vulnerability and used my history to create psychological pressure. Listening to the expert validate everything I felt about Rebecca's approach makes my chest tight. For months, I questioned whether I was reading too much into her behavior. Now, a professional is telling a jury that Rebecca's actions followed a deliberate pattern of manipulation. The defense lawyer tries to discredit the expert's credentials, but she has 20 years of experience studying workplace exploitation. Her testimony lasts all afternoon, and the jury takes careful notes throughout. Ralph takes the stand on day 4, looking nervous but determined. Vaughn asks about his role as a board member and his relationship with Rebecca. Ralph explains that he questioned several of her financial decisions and pushed for more oversight of her department. Then Vaughn introduces evidence of threatening emails Ralph received over 6 months. The emails are vague but menacing, suggesting Ralph should step down from the board for his own safety. Digital forensics trace the emails back to Rebecca's work computer using a fake account she created. Ralph's voice shakes slightly as he reads one email aloud that mentions his grandchildren by name. The jury shifts in their seats, looking uncomfortable. Vaughn asks if Ralph ever suspected Rebecca sent the emails. Ralph says no, he reported them to police, but never imagined a company executive would threaten a board member. The prosecution shows the jury the forensic report linking the emails directly to Rebecca's computer, with timestamps matching when she was logged into the company network. Rebecca's lawyer argues the computer could have been accessed by anyone with her credentials. The forensic expert testifies that Rebecca's unique typing patterns and common phrases appear throughout the threatening emails. The jury looks horrified as they piece together that Rebecca wasn't just recruiting me for murder, she was actively planning Ralph's death while building evidence to justify it. Ralph's testimony ends with him thanking me directly for preventing whatever Rebecca had planned. The judge reminds him to address the jury, but the moment still lands. The trial stretches across 2 weeks with testimony from IT specialists, HR personnel, and character witnesses. Rebecca's defense tries to argue that her conversation with me was hypothetical or taken out of context. They bring in a linguistics expert who claims the recording could be interpreted multiple ways. Vaughn destroys this argument by playing the recording again and asking the expert to explain what else Rebecca could have meant by needing someone handled permanently. The expert stumbles through weak explanations that the jury clearly doesn't buy. On the final day, both sides give closing arguments. Rebecca's lawyer paints me as a manipulative ex-convict who engineered the situation for personal gain. Vaughn counters by walking through the timeline of evidence showing Rebecca's calculated approach from my hiring through her threats against Ralph. He reminds the jury that I reported Rebecca immediately instead of accepting her offer, which demonstrates my character more than my criminal record. The jury gets the case at 2 p.m. I sit in the courthouse cafeteria with Vaughn drinking terrible coffee while we wait. Antonio shows up, even though I didn't ask him to, and sits with me without saying much. 6 hours later, the jury returns. Everyone files back into the courtroom and I can barely breathe. The foreperson stands and reads the verdict. Guilty on all counts, including solicitation of murder, criminal threatening, and abuse of corporate authority. Rebecca's face goes pale, and her lawyer immediately starts talking about appeals. The judge thanks the jury and sets a sentencing date for 3 weeks out. Walking out of the courthouse that evening, I feel a weight lift that I didn't know I was carrying. Antonio hugs me hard and says, "Justice actually worked this time." The sentencing hearing happens on a cold morning in February. Rebecca stands before the judge in an orange jumpsuit looking smaller than I remember. Her lawyer argues for leniency based on her lack of prior criminal history and contributions to the business community. Vaughn presents victim impact statements from Ralph and me. I read mine aloud, describing how Rebecca's manipulation made me question whether I'd ever escape my past. The judge listens carefully and then delivers Rebecca's sentence. 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. The judge specifically mentions my courage in reporting Rebecca rather than becoming complicit in her scheme. She says my actions likely saved Ralph's life and demonstrated that redemption is possible when people make the right choices. Sitting in that courtroom listening to the judge's words, I finally understand that my past doesn't define my character. My choices do. Rebecca tried to use my history to turn me into a murderer, but instead, I chose to protect someone and face the consequences of standing up to power. The difference between us isn't that I went to prison and she's going now. The difference is that I went to prison for an accident I couldn't prevent while she's going to prison for a murder she actively planned. Walking out of the courthouse for the last time, I feel closure that I never expected to find. Work feels different the Monday after Rebecca's sentencing because I'm no longer the person involved in an ongoing criminal case. People stop treating me carefully like I might break under pressure. Antonio organizes a low-key celebration dinner at a Mexican restaurant with 6 co-workers from our department. They toast to justice and moving forward, and I realize these people have become genuine friends. We spend 3 hours eating too much food and laughing about terrible clients and ridiculous audit requests. Nobody mentions Rebecca except once when Antonio raises his glass and says he's glad I trusted my instincts. The conversation moves naturally to weekend plans and sports and office gossip. Sitting there surrounded by people who know my full story and chose to be my friends anyway, I feel something close to peace. The dinner ends late, and we all walk to the parking lot together. Antonio claps me on the shoulder and tells me he's proud of me, which makes my throat tight. Driving home, I realize my life has expanded beyond survival mode into something that actually feels like living. Ralph calls me into his office on a Thursday afternoon looking pleased. He closes the door and tells me the board met yesterday to discuss my future with the company. I brace myself for bad news out of habit. Instead, Ralph explains that they want to promote me to financial analyst with a substantial raise and expanded responsibilities. The position reports directly to the CFO and involves strategic planning rather than just accounting work. Ralph says my work has been exceptional and the board wants to invest in my continued growth. He emphasizes that this promotion is based purely on merit and performance, not sympathy or legal obligation. I sit there processing the offer because part of me still expects opportunities to be taken away. Ralph asks if I'm interested, and I manage to say yes. He smiles and says the formal offer letter will arrive next week, but he wanted to tell me personally. Walking back to my desk, I feel like I've finally earned something through legitimate qualifications and hard work rather than manipulation or pity. The promotion means I'm building a real career with advancement potential. People will see me as a financial analyst moving up in the company, not as an ex-convict who got lucky. That distinction matters more than I can explain. My first session with Brigitte after the trial feels different because we're not picking apart what Rebecca did to me anymore. She sits across from me in her quiet office and asks what I want from my life now that the criminal case is closed. The question catches me off guard because I've spent 12 years just trying to survive each day. I tell her I don't know how to want things without feeling like I'm asking for too much. She writes something in her notebook and looks up at me with this calm expression that makes me feel less stupid for admitting that. She explains that people who've been through trauma often wait for permission to have normal desires like relationships, or career success, or basic happiness. I realize that's exactly what I've been doing since I got out of prison. Every good thing that's happened has felt like something I need to earn or justify rather than something I'm allowed to just have. Brigitte helps me understand that my history doesn't need to approve my future. She asks me to list 3 things I want without explaining why I deserve them. I sit there struggling with the exercise because my brain automatically wants to defend each wish. Finally, I manage to say, I want genuine friendships, a career that challenges me, and maybe someday a relationship with someone who sees me as a whole person. She smiles and tells me those are perfectly reasonable things to want. Walking out of her office, I feel lighter somehow, like she gave me permission to stop apologizing for being alive. Detective Fernandez emails me 2 days later with a brief message that makes me read it 3 times. He thanks me for my cooperation and courage throughout Rebecca's case. He writes that my recording likely prevented a murder, and I should be proud of trusting my instincts when someone tried to manipulate me. The email is professional but warm, and he mentions he's closing his case file now that Rebecca's appeal got denied. I sit at my desk, staring at those words about being proud and trusting my instincts. Law enforcement spent 12 years treating me like a criminal who needed watching. Now a detective is telling me I did something brave and right. I save the email in a folder I'll probably read again when I need the reminder that I'm not the person Rebecca tried to turn me into. Kieran from HR stops by my desk the following week, looking slightly nervous. He asks if I'd be willing to let the company profile me in their internal newsletter as an example of successful second-chance employment. My stomach drops, because the last thing I want is everyone knowing my full history. But Kieran explains they want to highlight their re-entry program, and my story demonstrates what's possible when companies give people genuine opportunities. He emphasizes it's completely my choice, and they won't include anything I'm not comfortable sharing. I think about it for 2 days before agreeing, because maybe my experience can help other people get hired despite having records. The newsletter comes out 3 weeks later with a tasteful article about my education in prison, the job search struggle, and how I reported Rebecca instead of becoming complicit. My hands shake when I see it published, because now everyone knows. But the response from colleagues surprises me. People stop by my desk to say they respect what I've been through. Antonio brings me coffee and tells me he's impressed by my guts. Even people I barely know send supportive emails. Nobody treats me like a criminal or a victim. They treat me like someone who survived something difficult and came out decent on the other side. Antonio and I start hanging out outside work after that. We grab lunch on Saturdays and watch basketball games at sports bars where nobody knows about my past. He's easy to be around because he doesn't treat me carefully or ask probing questions about prison. We just talk about normal stuff like terrible referees and which restaurants have the best wings. One Saturday he mentions there's a woman named Sarah who works in his apartment building, and she's funny and kind and recently single. I immediately feel panic rising because dating seems impossible when you have to explain a 10-year gap in your history. Antonio must see my face change because he quickly adds that Sarah knows about second chances since her brother did time for drug possession. He's not pushing anything, just thought I might want to meet her sometime. I tell him maybe, which we both know means I'm terrified but also interested. 2 weeks later, Antonio invites me to a cookout at his building, and Sarah is there. She's got this warm smile and makes jokes about Antonio's terrible grilling skills. We end up talking for an hour about books and music, and she doesn't ask anything about my work history. When the cookout ends, she gives me her number and suggests coffee sometime. I spend 3 days working up the courage to text her. We meet at a quiet cafe on a Sunday morning, and the conversation flows easily until she asks what I did before my current job. My coffee cup freezes halfway to my mouth. I could lie or deflect, but Brigitte's voice is in my head telling me I deserve honest connections. So I tell Sarah the truth about the forklift accident and the corporate cover-up and serving 10 years for something that wasn't my fault. She listens without interrupting, her expression serious, but not judgmental. When I finish, she's quiet for a moment before saying, Everyone deserves a second chance. Then she asks if I want to get coffee again next week. Relief floods through me so fast I almost knock over my cup. She's not running away or making excuses to leave. She's asking for a second date. Ralph continues mentoring me in corporate finance, and I discover I'm actually good at strategic financial analysis. He teaches me how to read market trends and evaluate investment opportunities. During one session, he walks me through a complex merger analysis, and I spot a potential risk factor he missed. Ralph looks impressed and makes a note about my observation. He starts giving me more challenging projects that require deeper thinking than basic accounting. One afternoon, he casually mentions I almost laugh because that seems impossible. But Ralph explains that the company has a tuition assistance program, and my work performance would make me a strong candidate. He's not joking. He's seriously suggesting I could get an advanced degree and move into executive-level finance. The idea feels too big to fit in my head. I spent 12 years thinking I'd be lucky to get any job at all. Now someone's talking about me getting an MBA and working in corporate strategy. Sarah and I date for 2 months, and everything moves slowly in a way that feels right. We see each other once or twice a week for coffee or dinner or walks in the park. She's patient when I get quiet and anxious about nothing in particular. We're at her apartment watching a movie when she asks about my nightmares because I mentioned having trouble sleeping. I tell her about the dreams where I'm back in prison or where the forklift accident happens over and over. She doesn't try to fix it or tell me it'll get better. She just listens and then holds my hand. Later that night, she tells me about her brother's struggle with addiction and how her family learned that past mistakes don't define someone's worth. I realize she understands in a way most people can't. We're both connected to the criminal justice system through circumstances that changed our families. She doesn't treat my conviction like a character flaw. She treats it like something that happened to me, not something I am. A re-entry program contacts me asking if I'd be willing to speak to people leaving prison about education and job searching. My first instinct is to say no because public speaking terrifies me. But I remember reading that newsletter profile and thinking maybe my story could help someone. I agree to speak at their next monthly meeting. Standing in front of 30 people who are about to be released, I tell them about getting my GED and degrees through correspondence courses. I talk about the brutal job interviews and the rejections and how I almost gave up. I explain how I recognized Rebecca's manipulation because prison taught me to watch for people who want to use me. Several participants approach me afterward, thanking me for being honest about how hard reintegration is. One guy tells me he's been putting off his GED because he thinks he's too old to learn. I tell him I started at 24 and finished at 25. He shakes my hand and says he'll sign up for classes. Walking out of that meeting, I feel like maybe the worst parts of my experience can actually help other people survive theirs. The sheriff who testified at my trial 12 years ago calls me out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice sounds older, but I recognize it immediately. He asks if I remember him, and I tell him I'll never forget what he did for me in that courtroom. He explains he's working on a case involving corporate negligence and worker safety at a construction company. They need someone who understands how corporations hide maintenance issues and blame workers when accidents happen. He's asking if I'd be willing to consult on the case. I sit there stunned because law enforcement is asking me for help instead of assuming I'm guilty of something. I tell him yes, before I fully process what I'm agreeing to. He sounds relieved and says my perspective could prevent other workers from getting blamed for corporate greed. After we hang up, I realize he sees me as a resource rather than a criminal. That shift in how authority figures view me feels almost as significant as getting the job offer from Rebecca all those months ago. My consulting work with the sheriff involves reviewing maintenance logs and incident reports from another construction company. I spot the same patterns I saw at my old job where corporate denied repairs and then altered records to blame equipment operators. The sheriff brings in investigators who find dozens of safety violations that could have caused serious accidents. The company gets fined heavily, and several executives face criminal charges for falsifying safety documents. Workers at that site will be protected because someone finally held the corporation accountable instead of scapegoating the people operating the equipment. Sitting in my apartment reading news coverage of the investigation, I realize my worst experience is contributing to protecting other workers. The trauma of killing someone and going to prison for it now has unexpected purpose. I can recognize corporate negligence patterns that other people might miss. My history gives me insight that actually helps prevent future accidents. That doesn't erase what happened to my coworker or the years I lost in prison. But it means those years weren't completely wasted. They taught me something valuable that I can use to protect people who are vulnerable to the same corporate manipulation that destroyed my life 12 years ago. Antonio catches me after a team meeting 3 weeks later and asks if I can grab lunch. We walk to the deli down the block, and he orders his usual turkey sandwich while I get coffee. He waits until we sit down before telling me he got promoted to senior financial analyst. I congratulate him and mean it because he's been helping me navigate office politics since Rebecca's arrest. He takes a bite of his sandwich and then says the company wants him to recommend someone to take over his previous responsibilities. My stomach drops because I know what's coming. He looks at me and asks if I'm interested in handling some of his old accounts and projects. The raise would be substantial and the work more complex than what I'm doing now. I tell him yes before I fully process the question, because opportunities like this don't come around twice. He grins and says he already told management I was his top choice. Walking back to the office, I realize I'm building a real career based on my actual skills and work performance. Nobody's mentioning my criminal record or looking at me like I'm damaged goods. I'm just another accountant getting promoted because I'm good at my job. Sarah meets Antonio and his family the following Saturday at a barbecue Antonio's hosting at his apartment complex. I'm nervous about mixing my girlfriend and my work friend, but they hit it off immediately. Antonio's wife asks Sarah about her work, and his kids show her their latest art projects. Ralph shows up later with his wife, and they all talk about normal things like vacation plans and home repairs. Watching Sarah laugh at Antonio's stories and help his wife set out food makes something settle in my chest. I spent so many years isolated and suspicious of everyone that I forgot what it feels like to have people who just like being around you. Sarah catches my eye across the patio and smiles, and I realize this is what a real life looks like. Not just surviving day to day, but actually building connections with people who know my full story and still want me around. Antonio's uncle who did time pulls me aside later and tells me I'm doing good and to keep my head up. He says he can see I'm not just making it work, but actually thriving. I thank him and mean it, because hearing that from someone who understands the struggle hits different from hearing it from people who've never been locked up. Brigitte's office feels different during our next session, because I'm not walking in carrying the weight of Rebecca's manipulation anymore. She asks how I'm doing, and I tell her about Antonio's promotion and meeting Sarah's friends and feeling like I'm actually building something real. She listens and takes notes, and then suggests we might consider reducing our sessions to once a month instead of weekly. I feel a spike of panic, because therapy has been my anchor through all of this. She explains that I've developed healthy coping skills and strong support systems, and that I don't need her as much anymore. I'm proud of my progress, and she's proud of how far I've come. She reminds me I can always schedule more sessions if I need them, but she thinks I'm ready to handle things on my own, with occasional check-ins. Walking out of her office, I feel both scared and proud, because graduating from weekly therapy means I'm actually healing from what Rebecca tried to do to me. Ralph requests a meeting with me and several board members 2 months after Antonio's promotion. I walk into the conference room expecting another mentoring session, but instead find half the board sitting around the table. Ralph stands and announces his retirement effective at the end of the quarter. Several board members congratulate him and ask about his plans. He thanks them and then turns to me and says he's recommending me for a junior analyst position reporting directly to the CFO. My hands go cold because junior analyst is a huge jump from my current role. Ralph explains that I've exceeded expectations in every project he's given me and that my financial analysis skills are exactly what the company needs. The board members look at each other, and one of them asks about my background. Ralph says my credentials speak for themselves and that my past conviction has nothing to do with my ability to do this job. Another board member mentions that I exposed Rebecca's criminal behavior, which showed strong ethical judgment. They vote right there in the room, and it's unanimous approval. I thank them and try to keep my voice steady, because 3 years ago I was in prison, and now I'm moving into corporate finance strategy. I proposed to Sarah 8 months after our first date. We're walking through the park near her apartment on a Sunday afternoon, and I just ask her. No fancy setup or elaborate plan, because that's not who we are. She stops walking and stares at me, and I pull out the simple ring I bought last week. She says yes before I finish asking and kisses me right there on the path. We plan a small wedding with Antonio as my best man, because he's become the closest thing to family I have outside Sarah. Ralph agrees to attend as an honored guest, and I'm overwhelmed by the idea of getting married surrounded by people who know I went to prison and love me anyway. Sarah wants to keep it simple with just close friends and Antonio's family. No big reception or fancy venue because we both prefer meaningful over impressive. Calling Antonio to ask him to be my best man feels significant because I'm choosing family based on who showed up for me rather than who's related by blood. He says yes immediately and jokes that someone needs to make sure I don't run away at the altar. The company features my story in their external corporate responsibility report 3 months before the wedding. Kieran asks my permission first, and I agree because maybe my experience will help other companies give people real second chances. The report describes my education in prison and my successful reintegration into the workforce. It mentions Rebecca's manipulation attempt and how I reported it rather than becoming complicit. Several other companies contact our HR department asking about our re-entry employment program. Kieran tells me they're formalizing policies I helped inspire just by being honest about my background and working hard. Reading the published report feels surreal because corporations usually hide people like me rather than featuring us as success stories. My coworkers congratulate me, and several mention they didn't know my full story. Nobody treats me differently afterward, which tells me they see me as the person I am now rather than the conviction from 12 years ago. Vaughn calls me on a Thursday afternoon to tell me Rebecca's appeal got denied. She'll serve her full 15-year sentence with no early release. I sit at my desk processing this news while coworkers move around the office doing normal work things. Rebecca tried to manipulate me into murder, and now she's facing real consequences that match the severity of what she attempted. Vaughn says the appeals court found no merit in her claims of entrapment or coercion. The recording I made was clear evidence of solicitation, and her pattern of targeting vulnerable employees made her case worse. I thank Vaughn for calling and hang up feeling something close to closure. She can't hurt me or anyone else for 15 years, and maybe by the time she gets out, she'll understand that people aren't tools for her to use. That night, I tell Sarah about the denied appeal, and she holds my hand and says I did the right thing by reporting Rebecca instead of running away from the situation. A criminal justice reform conference invites me to speak 6 weeks before my wedding. They want me to talk about education access in prison and employment opportunities after release. I'm terrified of public speaking, but I agree because maybe my story will help change policies that affect thousands of people. Standing on that stage looking at policymakers and advocates feels impossible, but I force myself to talk about getting my GED and degrees while locked up. I explain how education gave me hope when I had nothing else, and how my credentials opened doors that would have stayed closed otherwise. Several participants approach me afterward, thanking me for being honest about how hard reintegration is. One policymaker asks if I'd be willing to consult on re-entry program development, and I say yes, because I want to help create the support systems I wish I'd had. Walking out of that conference, I realize my worst experience can contribute to protecting other people from the same struggles I faced. Sarah and I get married in a simple ceremony at a small venue with 30 people who actually matter to us. Antonio stands next to me as my best man, looking proud and slightly emotional. Ralph attends with his wife and shakes my hand before the ceremony starts. The sheriff who testified at my trial 12 years ago shows up, and I almost cry when I see him. He tells me he knew I'd make something of my second chance, and that he's proud to be here. Sarah looks beautiful in a simple dress, and I focus on her face while we say our vows. We promise to support each other through whatever comes next, and I mean every word, because she saw my full history and chose me anyway. The reception is just dinner and dancing with people who've become chosen family. Antonio's kids run around causing chaos, and Ralph tells stories about his early career. The sheriff pulls me aside later and says he's seen a lot of people leave prison, and most of them struggle to rebuild, but I'm proof that second chances work when people get real support. Antonio and I start a consulting side business 2 weeks after my wedding. We're helping companies develop ethical second-chance hiring programs that actually give people opportunities rather than exploiting their desperation. We're not trying to get rich or build some empire. We just want to help other people avoid the brutal job search I experienced, where hiring managers laughed at my resume. Our first client is a manufacturing company that wants to hire people with records but doesn't know how to structure their program. We review their policies and suggest changes that protect both the company and the employees. Antonio handles the corporate relationship side, while I focus on the re-entry perspective because I lived through what these policies either help or hurt. Working on this project feels meaningful in ways my regular accounting job doesn't, because we're directly impacting people's ability to rebuild their lives after prison. Ralph's retirement party happens 3 weeks later in the company's main conference room with catering. That's nicer than anything I ate my first year out of prison. He shakes hands with everyone and makes jokes about finally having time for golf, but when he pulls me aside near the end, his expression gets serious. He tells me he's proud to have played a small role in my success, and I have to correct him because his impact was enormous, not small. Ralph smiles and says he's just a phone call away if I ever need advice, then hands me a business card with his personal cell number written on the back. Walking out of that party feels bittersweet because he's been such an important mentor, but I know he means it about staying in touch. 2 months after Ralph retires, Kieran calls me into his office to discuss a promotion to senior financial analyst with my own small team of 3 junior accountants. The salary increase is substantial, but what matters more is the chance to lead people and help them grow. I accept immediately and spend my first week as a team leader reviewing their work and learning their individual strengths. One of them is a young guy named Benjamin who keeps apologizing for minor errors and seems convinced he doesn't belong here. I recognize that feeling instantly because I lived with it for years, so I pull him aside and tell him everyone makes mistakes and his work is actually solid. Over the next few weeks, I make a point of mentoring Benjamin through his imposter syndrome, showing him how to catch errors before they become problems, and praising his analytical skills when he does good work. Passing forward, the support I received feels like honoring everyone who believed in me, and watching Benjamin gain confidence reminds me how much Ralph's encouragement changed my trajectory. Sarah and I start house hunting 6 months after my promotion because we're tired of renting and want something that's actually ours. The mortgage application process is overwhelming with all the paperwork and credit checks, but the loan officer treats us like normal people instead of looking at my background with suspicion. We find a small 2-bedroom house with a yard that needs work, and I'm overwhelmed by the normalcy of furniture shopping and comparing paint colors. Standing in our empty living room on moving day, I think about the cell I lived in for 10 years and how I used to dream about exactly this kind of ordinary life. This is real now. Not just a fantasy I had while other inmates told me I was wasting my time planning for a future that would never come. Sarah squeezes my hand and asks what I'm thinking about, and I tell her I'm just happy, which is true, but doesn't capture how much this moment means to me. The reentry program director calls me 2 weeks after we move in and asks if I'd be willing to join their advisory board. They want people with lived experience to help shape policies that give others genuine second chances, and I accept immediately, because I want to help create the support systems I wish I'd had. My experience with both corporate manipulation and authentic support gives me unique insight into what actually helps versus what just sounds good on paper. The first board meeting happens on a Saturday morning, and I sit with social workers, former program participants, and policy advocates discussing everything from housing assistance to employer partnerships. I share my perspective on how education access in prison gave me hope and real credentials, and several people take notes while I'm talking. Leaving that meeting, I feel like my worst experience can contribute to protecting other people from the same struggles I faced, which gives everything a purpose I never expected. 3 years after Rebecca's arrest, I'm thriving professionally with a career I built through legitimate qualifications and hard work instead of manipulation or exploitation. Antonio and I expand our consulting business beyond just helping companies develop second-chance hiring programs to also training their HR staff on how to support employees with criminal histories. Sarah and I are talking about starting a family, which terrifies and excites me in equal measure because I want to be the kind of father my coworker never got to be for his kids. I've built a life that honors the person I became rather than the mistake that defined me, and some days I still can't believe this is actually my reality. A letter arrives at my office one Tuesday afternoon from someone named James, who participated in the re-entry program I spoke at last year. He writes that he just landed his first job after release, working in a warehouse with a manager who gave him a real chance, and he wanted to thank me for showing him that rebuilding is possible. Reading his words at my desk, I realize my worst experience and Rebecca's manipulation attempt became the foundation for helping others, which gives everything unexpected meaning that I never could have anticipated. I keep his letter in my desk drawer and read it whenever I'm having a hard day, because it reminds me that surviving wasn't enough. I had to use what I survived to help other people survive too. Ralph calls me on a Thursday evening while I'm making dinner and tells me the board is considering me for a director-level position in 2 years if I continue my current trajectory. I almost dropped the phone because I'm stunned by how far I've come from the scared ex-convict who thought he'd never escape his past, and I'm excited about a future built on merit and genuine relationships instead of desperation and fear. Ralph laughs at my shocked silence and says he knew I had this potential from the first time we talked, which makes me grateful all over again for his belief in me. Sarah and I celebrate our anniversary by volunteering together at the re-entry program, helping participants practice interview skills and review their resumes. I look around at the people I'm helping and the life I've built with Sarah beside me and Antonio as my business partner and genuine friend. Rebecca tried to use my past to turn me into a murderer, but instead, her manipulation became the catalyst for me, finally believing I deserved the second chance I'd worked so hard to earn, and now I get to help other people believe they deserve their second chances too.